On a bitterly cold morning in the Yukon Territory, a convoy of trucks rumbled along a frozen road cutting through miles of spruce forest and snow-covered wilderness. Inside specially designed transport crates stood 28 wood bison, the last participants in a conservation gamble that many believed had little chance of succeeding. For generations, the wood bison had been vanishing from the northern landscape. The vast herds that once shaped river valleys and boreal forests had been reduced to a fragile remnant. By the time wildlife officials launched their recovery effort, the species had come frighteningly close to becoming a memory. When the crate doors finally swung open, the animals hesitated for only a moment before stepping into a landscape their ancestors had not occupied in over a century. No one standing there could know they were witnessing the beginning of a story that would unfold over the next 4 decades. At first, the goal was simple: keep the herd alive. But the bison had other plans. They pushed beyond the areas selected for them, appearing in places biologists never expected. They crossed waterways marked as natural limits to their expansion and established themselves across habitats stretching far beyond the original release site. As their numbers grew, subtle changes began appearing throughout the ecosystem, suggesting the return of a species capable of reshaping an entire landscape. Here at Hunt and Harvest Life, we've covered countless conservation stories, but few compare to what happened in the Pelly River Valley. What began with 28 animals became one of the most remarkable wildlife recoveries ever documented in North America, a living example of how nature can exceed even the boldest human expectations. This is that story. Before we can talk about what the bison are doing today, we need to understand what they are and why their absence matters far more than most people realize. When most Americans think of bison, they picture the iconic Plains buffalo. The wood bison is something else entirely. Its larger, rougher-built northern cousin, and genuinely staggering in scale. A mature bull can top 2,000 pounds and stand close to 6 feet at the shoulder, making it the heaviest land animal on the North American continent. In deep winter, wood bison use that enormous head and hump like a plow, sweeping aside snowdrifts several feet deep to reach frozen grasses beneath. They are built to endure conditions that would kill most other creatures. But size is the least interesting thing about them. Wood bison are what biologists call ecosystem engineers. As they graze, they crop meadow grasses low, preventing tall vegetation from crowding out more diverse plant communities beneath. Their hooves churn riverbanks and floodplains, creating conditions where new vegetation can take hold. When bison roll in the dirt, they excavate shallow depressions that fill with rainwater and gradually become small wetlands, breeding habitat for frogs, salamanders, and insects with nowhere else to go in an otherwise dry boreal landscape. Their dung redistributes nutrients across enormous areas, and older females pass generational knowledge to their calves: migration routes, mineral licks, the best winter meadows. Take all of that away and you don't just lose a species, you shut off an entire ecological engine. That engine was shut off deliberately, or at least carelessly. Through the mid-1800s, commercial hunters pushed northward through the boreal forests, killing wood bison at industrial scale. Repeating rifles made slaughter efficient, the hides were valuable, the market was hungry, and no one was counting. By the early 20th century, only around 250 wood bison remained in all of North America. Canada responded by establishing Wood Buffalo National Park in 1922. But then, in one of the more consequential errors in North American conservation history, wildlife managers introduced thousands of plains bison into the same park. The two subspecies interbred immediately. Disease swept through populations with no immunity. Within 2 decades, The genetic identity of the wood bison had become so blurred that biologists reached a grim consensus. The pure wood bison was effectively extinct. For more than a decade, that conclusion held. Then came the lucky afternoon that changed everything. In the spring of 1957, a Canadian Wildlife Service researcher named Gerald Fenn was conducting a routine aerial survey over a remote corner of Wood Buffalo National Park when he spotted something below that made him circle back. A herd of roughly 200 bison, isolated from the hybrid populations by more than 100 kilometers of roadless wilderness. He dropped lower. Something looked different. The shoulder humps were higher, more squared off than the hybrids he knew. He filed his report and waited. Testing confirmed what Fenn had suspected. These animals were genuine wood bison, disease-free, genetically pure, and hidden in the Canadian wilderness for decades. A species the scientific community had mourned as extinct had never actually disappeared. Canada suddenly had something it thought it had lost forever: a source population. What followed was patient, deliberate work, the kind that rarely makes headlines but determines whether a species lives or dies. A small number of animals from the rediscovered herd were relocated to protected facilities as a genetic safeguard. The most critical managed herd was established at Elk Island National Park in Alberta, where wildlife managers monitored breeding, tracked genetics, and slowly grew the population under controlled conditions. By the early 1980s, the Elk Island herd had grown large enough to allow the selection of founder animals for wild release. The site chosen was the Pelly River Valley in the Yukon. Open meadows, river flats, mineral licks, and the kind of habitat wood bison had used for thousands of years. In the spring of 1983, a military transport plane landed on a gravel airstrip in the backcountry. The cargo doors opened, and 28 wood bison walked out into a valley that hadn't heard hooves in over a century. The biologists watching from the tree line held their breath. The bison didn't seem to need much time to remember what to do. Within months, researchers documented extensive ecological activity across the Pelly River flats. The animals grazed intensively, trimming meadow grasses low and opening the ground beneath. They wallowed near the river, creating depressions that collected water before the first fall rain. They moved along the floodplains with what looked, to watching biologists, almost like familiarity. It was the first sustained wood bison ecosystem engineering seen on this landscape in over a century, and it resumed almost immediately. Supplemental releases from Elk Island eventually brought the total founder count to 99. Local Diné communities, who carried oral histories of the bison's presence in the region, watched the recovery with wonder and recognition. The herd faced real threats: anthrax outbreaks, wolf predation, brutal winters that suppressed reproduction for entire seasons. But the population kept growing. By the late 1990s, something was becoming clear that the original recovery team had not fully anticipated. The Pelly River Valley was no longer enough to contain what they had started. The herd had grown well beyond the boundaries managers had assumed it would occupy. Wildlife officials, recognizing that a single population in a single valley was not a stable long-term strategy, began establishing additional herds in the southern Yukon, the Mackenzie watershed, and remote areas near the British Columbia border, creating redundancy against the kind of catastrophe that had nearly erased the subspecies in the first place. Within the Pelly system itself, growth was striking. By the turn of the millennium, the population had exceeded 200 animals. By 2017, aerial surveys counted approximately 960 bison occupying nearly 10,000 square kilometers, a range larger than Yellowstone National Park and still expanding. By virtually every standard metric, the project had become one of the most successful large mammal reintroductions in Canadian history. Canada's wildlife authorities responded by reclassifying the wood bison from endangered to threatened. The transport flights eventually stopped. No more crates, no more founder releases. The Pelly herd was sustaining itself. And then the bison did something no one had planned for. Over the years following the original release, animals began showing up in places wildlife managers had never designated as fawn habitat, places they had never scouted, never expected bison to reach. The biggest surprise involved the Pelly River itself. When the recovery program was designed, the wide, cold river had been treated as a natural barrier defining the western edge of the herd's range. The thinking made sense. The Pelly is broad, fast, and frigid. The bison didn't consult the map. They swam across on their own. Multiple animals, multiple crossings. On the far side, they stayed, found habitat, and established permanent populations in areas of northeastern British Columbia that hadn't seen wild bison in over a century. The descendants of those 28 founder animals now occupy territory across 3 Canadian jurisdictions. Not because humans guided them there, because they went. The geographical expansion was only half of the story. For more than a century, boreal landscapes across the northern Yukon had been quietly changing in the bison's absence. Meadows that had once been open and diverse gradually filled in as shrubs and young trees moved into the gaps. Old wallows disappeared. Nutrient cycling slowed. The soils and plant communities became different, and so gradually that by the time researchers arrived, the altered landscape looked like the natural state of things. Now, those trends are reversing. Along the Pelly Corridor and the river systems the bison have colonized, meadows are being kept open again. Wallows are collecting water. Amphibians are returning to small wetlands that had been dry depressions for decades, and the insects that depend on those wetlands are returning with them. The broader science supports what is happening here. A 2022 study published in PNAS found that reintroducing bison to Kansas prairie nearly doubled native plant diversity. That research involved plains bison on grassland, but the underlying principle is the same. Large grazers don't just live in ecosystems. They shape them. They maintain conditions that no other force can replicate. The full ecological accounting of the wood bison's return is still being written, but the direction is unmistakable. There is one more dimension to this story that has nothing to do with ecology, and everything to do with what it means to lose something and then find it again. In the traditional language of the Dieng people of the region, there has long been a word for the wood bison. That cultural restoration running alongside the ecological. "40 years later, their offspring occupy thousands of square kilometers. The deeper lesson may be a humble one. Humans did not restore that valley. What the recovery team actually did was simpler and more profound. They returned the animal that knew how to do it. And then they stepped aside. The bison hadn't forgotten anything. They just needed the chance to remember.